to welcome you to our keynote session, which is devoted to the US role in the world between maximalism and retrenchment. And we are absolutely delighted and honored to have with us Ambassador Steve Sestanovich, the George F. Kennan Senior Fellow for Russian and East European, or sorry, I should say Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Professor for the Practice of International Diplomacy at Columbia University. The topic of today's session is, of course, an extremely timely and important one. I should mention that Ambassador Sestanovich has just published this book called Maximalist, America in the World, From Truman to Obama. And of course, it's on this theme that he will speak. The Obama administration has long sought to reposition the United States in the international arena, hoping to turn back a decade of war, to reduce American vulnerabilities, of course, in the Middle East and around the world, to rebalance toward Asia, and emphasize nation building here at home. And this is an ambitious agenda, but not an unfamiliar one, as Ambassador Sestanovich argues in his book. Retrenchment presidents of the past, those who charted a new path after major wars, give us a framework for evaluating the foreign policy of the Obama administration. So what can we learn from historical experience in the light of events in Ukraine and Crimea at the moment? How does the changing US-Russian relationship influence the United States' foreign policy objectives? Can an administration remain committed to retrenchment through the whole of its term, even as events in the world change? And there's really nobody we could have who would be better to address these questions than our speaker today. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sestanovich, who was part of his long CV, which I have forborne to read out, was at one time ambassador at large for the former territories or former countries of the Soviet Union. Steve, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, David. Thanks to all of you for welcoming me here. I have to begin with a word as someone who has taught courses involving negotiated simulations that the students were talking about. My principle in overseeing such enterprises was always to make sure there was no agreement, so that the students would come away with an appropriately realistic view of what diplomacy can accomplish. The last thing you want to do is give people the idea the problems of the world are easily resolved. Washington, which I flew out of this morning at 6 o'clock, is consumed in a suddenly intense debate about American foreign policy. It's a moment that George Kennan described as like a stone thrown into a beehive, by which he meant the buzzing of every element of the Washington community, policymakers, pundits, legislators, foreign diplomats, other kibitzers of this process, in which they all flail around trying to figure out what to do. I want to cut into this debate by putting it in historical context. And as David said, not coincidentally, the history of American foreign policy since World War II is the subject of my book, Maximalist, America in the World, From Truman to Obama. In it, I try to get my arms around this big topic, which has not been understudied. But I feel that it's important to do so now because the history of American foreign policy is in some ways increasingly remote to us. We think of a time when the United States was so successful, so able to use its vast resources for great international projects, when it enjoyed a domestic consensus, able to apply the same policy from decade to decade. That seems so different from now. To my mind, the past is relevant for a very different reason. It's that it was chaotic, confused, marked by frequent failure, intense domestic discord, alliances under stress, a foreign policy that changed from administration to administration. I like to point out that most American presidents have come in since 1947, and Harry Truman himself, thinking that their predecessors were way off track. That was true of Truman and Roosevelt, Eisenhower and Truman, Kennedy and Eisenhower. I like to point out Ronald Reagan thought the Cold War had been lost for was being lost for at least the last 3 administrations. So that tumult and the very mixed results, internal discord, are much more like the present. And I think we're able to see our own debates, whether it's Syria and Ukraine, more clearly in that context. I wanted in the book also to make it a kind of entertaining and vivid story. So you've got people, presidents and their advisors, calling each other traitors and in general at each other's throats, allies despairing of American good sense. My favorite quote along these lines is Secretary John Connally, who described his international economic policy, if you could call it that, in these terms: "The foreigners are trying to screw us, and I intend to screw them first." This is a lively story. There's a risk, though, when you tell history this way, of making it, as somebody once said about history, just one damn thing after another. And so I try to organize a little bit. Crudely, you may think, but bear with me. I want to try to impose a little bit of order in it by arguing that American foreign policy really operates in 2 different modes, what I call maximalism and retrenchment. Each one is adopted when the previous policy is seen not to be working. It's very easy to describe these 2 modes. Maximalism is the strategic theory of doing more, thinking bigger, pedal to the metal. It's what happens when there's a consensus that previous policy involved undercommitment. Retrenchment is the opposite. Do less, think harder, put on the brakes. It's what happens when previous policy is seen to involve overcommitment. Maximalism, historically, was the response to the vulnerability of Western Europe in the 1940s, to the Korean War, to many of the crises of the Cold War. But we see it after the Cold War, too. I think in the ambitious efforts of President Bush to unify Germany, overruling all of our allies. You see it in even in the approaches of the Clinton administration in the Balkans, and to the ambitious conceptions of globalization that were President Clinton's favorite theme. And of course, you see it in the response to 9/11. In all of these cases, presidents wanted a big package of measures. They wanted increased resources. They wanted to commit American prestige. They were ready to shake up the status quo because they thought the status quo was going against the United States. It's moments like that that led George Kennan to describe policymaking as like a stone thrown into a beehive. That kind of frenzy often produces maximalist results. After the maximalist policy party gets out of hand, of course, there's the retrenchment hangover. And retrenchment is the downsizing that follows after the Korean War, after the Vietnam War, after the Cold War, and now after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're a time in which foreign policy shrinks, resources are cut, Burdens are shifted to allies. New principles of American foreign policy are identified. I don't put this in the book because it seems so crude and simple-minded, but roughly the 40s, the 60s, the 80s, and the 2000s are maximalist decades. You see why I didn't put it in the book. The 50s, the 70s, the 90s, and the 20-teens are retrenchment decades. It's almost too tidy, but it fits, with give or take a year here and there. And I want to say a little bit about each, and then turn to discussion. But I think the first thing to say about these two modes is that they're not mutually exclusive. They have some overlap, and for a reason. Maximalist and retrenchment presidents are wary of overdoing it. They understand the pitfalls of their policy. So for me, John F. Kennedy is the perfect maximalist who's always looking for an escape hatch, something that will prevent dangers from getting too great. Richard Nixon is the opposite. He's the retrenchment president who's always trying to work himself up into an activist lather, because he worried that retrenchment would involve America going down the drain. And so he was looking for easy victories. The thing I want to say about this, though, is that one element tends to dominate. And in fact, it turns out to be very difficult for presidents to fine-tune and change course. They tend to overdo it. Maximalists tend to overdo it. Retrenchers tend to overdo it. And that's what produces the alternation between them. Retrenchment presidents come in to correct the errors of maximalists. Then, when people get fed up with that approach, they turn to new maximalist leadership. A few more words about maximalism, a few more words about retrenchment, and then I'd be eager to get your questions. What causes American policy to be so maximalist, to think that ambitious approaches are necessary, that you have to take on problems with this all-consuming approach? Part of it is, of course, great power. And for many people, that's all you need to know. But I think there are other elements that are worth flagging, apart from the conviction, which crisis brings, that there's something about the status quo that's inadequate, that it's getting out of hand, and that there need to be new approaches. Let me mention a few of those. One is characteristic of maximalist presidents is the conviction that other people are not going to be able to contribute very much. They're weak, parochial, disorganized, unstrategic, not able to bring much to the table or to the party. This is a kind of characteristic arrogance of American policy. It originates at a time when we didn't really think this was true, but I actually came to the conclusion that it was, and that's in the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was a period where others really couldn't contribute very much to solving international problems. Americans became convinced that they had to take charge of formulating international solutions because others were just too feeble and short-sighted. But you see that in much later days. The view that the Marshall Plan giants of our diplomacy had of what someone else once called old Europe, is pretty much the same. George Marshall and Donald Rumsfeld didn't think so differently about what Europeans could contribute. Secondly, it's closely related, and that is a very intense skepticism about what international solutions can contribute to international order. My favorite quote on this is Hillary Clinton at the end of the Copenhagen climate change negotiations, where she said, "I haven't been to any meeting so badly organized since my 8th grade student council." That's very characteristic of American policymakers. Third, a conviction that halfway measures won't hold, that you've got to solve problems entirely. This was, by the way, George Marshall's theme in his speech setting out the Marshall Plan at Harvard. He said, we're not interested in palliative measures. We want cures. You see the same thing in many other episodes of American policy. In the Korean War, Dean Acheson thought it wasn't viable to just fight back to the dividing line between North and South. He said, how would that last? Would we be able to sustain what seemed to him like an unstable status quo? One of the reasons for that, and it's a further measure, is our policymakers have historically believed that the American people had short attention spans and that you couldn't really expect long-term strategies to work. You had to devise something that would work quickly. So Marshall said to the people designing the plan, we've got 3 years. The American people will not do this longer. Stay in Europe? Keep aiding other countries? No way. You've got 3 years. And finally, guilty consciences as a factor in maximalism. Many of, I would say actually all of the presidents who launched the big unsuccessful military operations of the past 70 years, 60 plus years, all knew they'd done too little beforehand. Truman in taking troops out of Korea, Johnson in not actually, I hope we'll be able to come back to this, not actually positioning himself to do anything despite all the pressures of his advisors in Vietnam, and then George W. Bush, who had paid really no attention to terrorism before 9/11. Let me say a word about retrenchment. I want to close on this because it's the current phase that we're in. Like maximalists, retrenchers are all basically quite similar to each other. So I've tended to group President Obama with President Eisenhower and President Nixon because they're the sort of the most strategic of our retrenchers. Their task is always to scale back after excess. It's not isolationism, I should make clear. To the extent we have isolationism in American thinking about foreign policy, it tends to be in the party that has been responsible for the previous mess. So that you had in the 70s, you had McGovernite Democrat isolationism. And now you've got McGovernite Republican isolationism. It's the same kind of phenomenon. Retrenchment presidents tend to think you can create a sustainable policy for the long haul. Those are two big phrases for them, sustainable and the long haul. Those were Eisenhower's ideas, Nixon's, the first President Bush, and I think very much President Obama's. And they're clearly necessary for a time when you've got to wrap up and disengage from a previous mess. As I said earlier, though, retrenchment presidents tend to overdo it in a way that I think is not so different from the way maximalist presidents overdo it. They eventually have to explain, because they've said, I want a steady state, sustainable long-haul policy. They have to explain whether or not they should be responding to some new crises and challenges that arise after they've dealt with the mess. And that often positions them to minimize, because they want to wrap up the ambitious retrenchment policies in a more cohesive and self-sustaining way, leads them to position themselves against critics who say, why are you failing to rise to the occasion of these new problems? That was what President Obama heard last fall about Syria. It's what President Obama is hearing today about Ukraine. Retrenchment presidents tend to paint their critics as extremists or tools of special interests, when in fact the real risk to retrenchment is when it loses the support of the center. That's what happened with détente in the 70s. That's what happened in at the end of the 50s. And retrenchment presidents tend to become very committed to what they're doing. Very hard to change course. All presidents find it hard to change course. So that even in 1980, as President Carter was leaving office, he was writing in his diary, I think we need about 5 or 6 more years of détente with the Soviet Union. way out of touch with what the center of American political opinion was at that time. A couple more points about what characterizes retrenchment. Great presidential control. Eisenhower, Nixon, Obama are great centralizers of policy in the White House. And one last thing, our retrenchment presidents tend to be poor users of the bully pulpit, weak rhetorical leadership, which is a real surprise when you think about Barack Obama that way. Although people have been shaking their heads about President Obama and saying, why is it that the most gifted orator of our time has turned out to be such a weak user of presidential rhetoric? My answer is retrenchment presidents are always inarticulate. Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Bush 41, that's a record of inarticulateness that I think you've got to reckon with. People often ask me, which is better, maximalism or retrenchment? I say, you know, how are you going to like one over the other when they both screw up? Digging into American foreign policy in the way I try to do in the book convinced me that it's very, very hard to draw the line between the just right policy and doing too much. And our presidents have not been good at that. So my even-handed answer is we want to learn enough from retrenchment to know what not to try to do, what overdoing it is in retrenchment, or what kind of retrenchment is necessary. We want to learn enough from maximalism to know what we need to try to do, what makes big policy initiatives work. I've grown skeptical of the idea that we can find a policy that's good for all seasons. To the contrary, I think at just the moment where you're convinced that you've got the policy that's going to be good for the next 2 decades, you're probably about ready to have to change course. That's my framework. The book is about the stories, the presidents and decision-making and internal chaos in White Houses and in alliance consultations that make that convincing. And the controversies about the policies that lead always to turning points. With that, I think it's possible to come back to today's controversies and think about the ways in which our president and policymakers today are addressing the question of how much retrenchment to keep and where they may want to take a more ambitious stance, because that is the key problem that we've really found it extremely difficult to solve, knowing when to shift from one to the other. Thank you very much.
Okay.
David, you're the master of the cards, is that?
I'm the master of the cards
and
here.
so I'm supposed to come and be...
Sit? Yeah.
Yes.
So I already have a number of questions. Let me encourage others of you to send up questions. But I'm going to exploit the prerogative of the master of the cards and ask a question. In your book, you quoted this comment by Dennis Blair, who was CINCPAC and then head of the CIA. We're Americans. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And it's, I think it's interesting because one of the questions I have, you explained, where this comes from, the great power, the sense of, at some level, in theory, any problem out there is a problem the US should be able to solve. And moreover, it's thought of in terms of problems, not in terms of necessarily managing a process. How deeply rooted is that in the American kind of DNA? Because, there is the argument that if the US engages in the world and it did indeed at the time of the revolution regard European great power politics as something intrinsically evil and something you should stay out of. If it engages in the world, it also wants to transform the world. So there's a kind of transformative element. So that seems to me that's very deeply rooted. That wouldn't just be post-World War II, although the great power post-World War II gives it a particular significance. And that makes me ask then, do you see any way in which this pattern of retrenchment and maximalism will change? We're basically stuck with this? I mean, you offered some, I thought... Okay.
No. I don't want to cut you off.
You offered some thoughts on that point at the end, but I would like to hear you say more about that.
Let me clarify one thing. I don't believe that the United States approaches every problem in maximalist terms when it suddenly sees a challenge. And as I've said, half of the presidents I look at are retrenchment presidents. Because when things get out of control, then you realize, maximalism ain't such a great idea after all. But even maximalist presidents tend to subordinate a lot of problems, and they focus their maximalism on what they think of as the main challenge to American security. You asked, though, how deep in the American DNA is this impulse? And I think it is very deep. I think it comes from a conviction that other countries have screwed the world up. And why did it take particular form after World War II? Well, a conviction that the 2 world wars had been the responsibility of others, and we now needed a different approach that was going to make for a sustainable order over a long period of time. That was based, I think, on two particular conceptions of of how the world had worked and would work. One was the traditional one that I've mentioned. That is, other countries just are poorly suited by all kinds of parochial dispositions to actually resolve problems. The second, though, involved a doubt about an American approach, which was the one developed at the end of World War II, and that is multilateral solutions. From the very beginning, Americans were skeptical of how much that approach would be able on its own to offer by way of really stabilizing problems. And so they tended to think that you had to add what Dean Acheson called the added energy of America in order to make those mechanisms work. And I think the question for the future of American policy is this. Obviously, American power is not going to be so dominant that we can simply think, we'll just do this because others screw up. There is going to have to be some accommodation. But for me, the question is how to reconcile our skepticism about what others can do. I quoted Hillary Clinton in the 8th grade student council. I think that is very deep in policymakers' DNA, both about the outlook that others have. Hillary Clinton also in another speech said, other people just tend to mess things up. They're guided by inertia, history, their geography, all kinds of things that are Americans disdain. We can overcome all those things. And I think we have to find a way of reconciling our suspicion of what others can do and our suspicion of international mechanisms with the new reality of our diminished power.
Right. This sounds to me like an ad for Hillary Clinton as the next maximalist president. No, I shouldn't say that. I know, I didn't. I'm not.
No commercial endorsements here.
One question which has come from the audience is what to do about the current crisis in Ukraine. And you mentioned in your talk that you've come from Washington, and I assume your reference was to the stone being thrown into the beehive is what's happening in Ukraine.
Right.
So how does that play into a kind of retrenchment maximalist framework? And, well, more specifically, what should the U.S. be doing about it?
Yeah. It is a maximalist stone in the beehive moment in this sense that the administration is just calling for any idea that can possibly be, be defended as a part of a package of measures. I mean, we see this all the time when there's something really bad that happens. Balanced against that is an anxiety about whether the world economy is stable enough to be able to take far-reaching measures, especially sanctions against Russia, and whether the American people are really ready for this, and whether the Congress will support it. So there's a sense of deep urgency and frustration, a desire to show that the president can be effective, with, at the same time, the characteristic restraints of retrenchment, concern about domestic support, resources, and so forth. And I think that has not been resolved yet. There are going to be measures announced on Monday after the referendum, that's for sure. But this is a debate that is likely to play out. This is not a retrenchment that's just going to end in a flash of new consensus.
Right. So, so that raises the question then, what will trigger the next shift from retrenchment to maximalism?
Yeah, I think history makes you expect some kind of more maximalist or activist, if you're more comfortable with that less, crazy sounding description. Right. You can't be sure that'll happen. Retrenchments take a long time to play out. And this would be a relatively quick retrenchment if it were to end now. That's why I don't expect it. But some transformation that galvanizes American opinion and makes people think, the world is really going to hell in a scary direction that we have to do something about. Real military confrontation in East Asia of some sort would certainly have that characteristic catalytic effect. You can imagine scenarios in the Middle East. Nobody expected that scenario in Europe. But I think you may find that this, at least in Europe, you get a real change toward a more ambitious policy as a result of what's happened in Ukraine. And I think it will, just for a moment, think of the analogy to the 40s. What the policy of containment was about was how to check Soviet power without war. And it meant trying to shore up everything on our side of the line. I think you're likely to have a pretty ambitious commitment of a kind that the Obama administration would never have believed that it would have to undertake to really making Ukraine, what remains of Ukraine, whether it loses just Crimea or other provinces, a success. Building up on our side of the line was really the policy of the 40s. But it was a very far-reaching policy, and it involved a lot of unexpected dimensions that people, when they first formulated the Marshall Plan, didn't really anticipate. You could imagine a quite transformed European order that was involved a kind of revived division of Europe. And I think that might not rise to the level, we might not want to call that maximalism, but I think it would be a very radical shift in the way we've imagined our European policies.
If I can comment.
I should say, David has just come back from Moscow, and he's going to speak with some authority on these problems.
I just got back last night, not in connection with this, but of course it's what everyone is talking about. And majority opinion, even among people who don't support Putin, is somehow, well, this is a moment where we must rally around the Russian flag. But the thought I had was that the European Union, I'm going to say the Europeans did do something since World War II, but the European, I mean, with American help, okay. The European
I'm not saying the maximalist perspective is always correct in the way they analyze other countries.
The European Union has basically made an effort to get away from centuries of wars among European states and the grabbing of land. We don't now care, I think, very much whether Alsace-Lorraine belongs to France or to Germany, right? But unfortunately, it does matter to Ukraine and Russia, where Crimea belongs. And this, while I was in Moscow, one of the well-known historians gave a speech comparing Russian policy with Hitler's policy in Czechoslovakia, you know, taking the Sudetenland where there was a German population. He was fired from his job, but actually reinstated the following day. So who knows what his future will hold. But that does seem to be a reversion to an older kind of politics. And I think you're right that although the immediate response may look rather weak, the long-term implications are actually very considerable in Europe. Yeah.
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
It was months after Hitler took the Sudetenland that he took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Yeah. So we may not find out how far Putin intends to go on Tuesday. Yeah. You know, this may play out for a while as he tries to calm things down. And so this may be a long-running crisis that commands the administration's attention. Again, something they could never have imagined.
Right. Let me come back then to the question. You've drawn parallels to the 1940s, which many people, I think with great reason, look back to as a period of enormous creativity in American foreign policy. I mean, essentially implementing an idea of containment. And it was, as you said, very far-reaching. But assume now we had people of the caliber of, you know, Marshall and Kennan as a thinker and so on. Could America do that now? Hasn't the world changed in ways that make the idea of an American kind of supported international system really much more difficult to envisage because the rise of China, because of the growth of other economies, the limits on American power? How far can we push the historical analogies?
Oh, I wouldn't push them terribly far. I think that's a stupid kind of history, to be honest. Mm-hmm. I'm all for presentism, as I say in the book, to draw lessons from history, but not in a crude way that just draws the lessons we want about the present day. We have to really be honest about what the differences are between the present and the past, so as to gain any meaningful lessons from them. But I just go back to what I said about the lingering suspicions that American policymakers tend to have about what kinds of constructive solutions you get when you let others do it on their own. And I'll give you an example of this. We've had for several years this intricate and sustained and in some ways quite successful diplomacy with Iran on its nuclear program. And the administration has liked the look of the big conference table. Mm-hmm. You know, they like the idea that everybody's there, that it's not just the United States and Iran. But when it got down to short strokes, it was the United States and Iran. You know, behind the scenes, they were cutting the deal. The United States did not have the confidence that you could actually get a solution out around a big table. Mm-hmm. It felt, if you want to get a real answer, you got to do it yourself. China is going to be the big challenge for this because they're just too powerful for us to say, well, other countries don't come up with good solutions. Yeah. Although I think many people really do have that view of China and say climate change, right, or China and their atavistic territorial view of, whether it matters who owns what bit of land or rock or anything. So there is a kind of, even in the view of China today, a kind of suspicion about that I think it carries over from decades of American dominance, suspicion about what they can actually contribute. Mm-hmm. So I'm not answering your question in the sense that, what I'm saying is, yeah, we're going to have a lot to get over in order to adapt our old ways to a new reality.
Right, right. So let me actually come back to Ukraine, because there are a number of questions asking specifically what the U.S. should do. I mean, what's your sense, given your own experience?
Well, I'll try to be really brief on this because I'm not super close to the discussions about things like what kind of IMF agreement one should have for them. I think the focus should probably not be on Crimea in terms of what we do. I like to draw the analogy to the 40s, in which the focus of American policy was not on loosening Soviet control of Eastern Europe, but on making sure that on our side of the line you had stable societies. Mm-hmm. And the analogy here is making Ukraine stable, successful enough so that the Russians cannot just break it apart at their will, whether it's 5 months from now or 5 years from now. Because if that happens, the entire European order is just turned upside down. Mm-hmm. The settlement of the early 90s will be wrecked, and nobody will know what countries can survive. So I think you have to have a pretty far-reaching policy, not just of economic support for a Ukrainian government, but really enabling them to deal with their security problems. I like to point out that to do what they did in Crimea, the Russians actually had planes that went in. To go into eastern Ukraine, they'd just put people in an SUV and drive across the border. Mm-hmm. And that is a very precarious situation, intense vulnerability for Ukraine in its eastern areas. They need a real border. Mm-hmm. They need all kinds of help in establishing themselves as a real state, which they've spent 20 plus years not doing. Yeah. So do you think, a number of questions on this point, do you think that in periods of retrenchment, the US becomes more vulnerable because it's regarded as weakening? In other words, you've painted a picture of a cycle, which is maximalism, retrenchment, then assertion of power, then a withdrawal. But of course, many people in the downturn don't see that there's going to be, maybe downturn is the wrong term, but many people outside the US or even inside the US think, oh, retrenchment just means America is in decline. Yeah. It doesn't, so therefore it becomes more vulnerable to challenges by other states. Do you think that's a serious problem? Well, I think, today in East Asia, you've got all kinds of governments saying to themselves and to the United States, are you really with us or not? What should we expect? And I'll give you one. There are many tests that they will look at to decide whether or not the United States is in decline or just pausing for a little bit, and whether it's gone into deep unseriousness about its commitments or not. The president in 2011 said, all this talk about defense cuts, it's not going to affect the fleet in East Asia. It turns out it is going to affect the fleet. And it's going to, he established this as, to coin a phrase, a red line. Now people in the Pentagon are really quite unsure about their ability to stick with that commitment. So, reduced resources, reduced leadership attention do tend to raise questions about whether the United States will remain engaged. One other example that I think is quite important right now. If the United States gets an agreement with Iran to limit its nuclear program, the question is going to be, is it going to use that agreement as a reason for reduced interest in the Middle East, which many people in the administration have said is their goal. But American allies in the Middle East think that if you get an agreement, the only thing that can justify it is an increased American commitment in the Middle East, because Iran is going to be a greater problem. They're going to ask about breakout capabilities for nuclear weapons and so forth. So the issue is, does an agreement become a way out the door for the United States, or part of a reconsolidation of American commitment? And I think on that we just don't know. But it reflects the way in which retrenchment has typically raised questions about what America's long-term interest in standing by commitments that it has made will actually be.
So if we take the case of China, and so China has made moves to assert its military and economic, well, military most spectacularly, presence in East Asia.
Yeah.
So is there a difference between what a maximalist president would do and what a retrenching president would do? At some level, the shift in the balance of power can't be ignored. Let's assume that the shift in the balance of power can't be ignored, and therefore some kind of accommodation, which recognizes the rise of China, has to take place. But then the question is, how can that work?
Well, I think shifts in the balance of power can be ignored in this sense. That is, people can say, ignored in the sense that, well, that doesn't bother us.
Yeah.
We used to be worried about Chinese capabilities and the ability to deny American access to the offshore island chains and so forth. A new generation of American strategic thinkers could decide, well, no, actually, we're just downsizing our ambitions. So I think there is a real difference, which we have not begun to reckon with, between those two strategies. Right. And it may seem hard to imagine now, but 5, 10, 15 years down the road, people can argue, look, we just don't have the ability to exercise power and influence in the way that we used to. You could call that a way of not ignoring the balance of power. Exactly. But the rise in Chinese power can be met by attempts to shore up American commitments and presence in East Asia, or a kind of accommodation, as you said. And I think it's absolutely open what the choice is going to be. But I think you see some of the ingredients of possible choices in our past responses. In the 50s, we thought we were dealing with rising Soviet power. In the 70s, we thought we were dealing with rising Soviet power, and that tended to end retrenchment. Some kinds of responses to rising Chinese power could end retrenchment, or they could prolong it indefinitely.
So, one question about your own experience as an ambassador. And the question is, what was your proudest moment? Or you can say, what was your... Well, no, probably the question of what was your...
Well, that is a tough one, but let me give you one that's quite relevant to something that's happening now. In the wake of the Russian financial crisis in 1998, where the Russian economy was melting down, a new government, actually rather hostile to the United States, came in under Primakov with a lot of communist economic advisors, they were communists, they were members of the Communist Party. The question was what American policy would be. I think it was important for our policy at the time that we did two things. We both recognized how much Russia would benefit, in fact, from a crisis that it we had all tried to stave off.
Right.
And that was, deep devaluation actually was the principal ingredient for Russian revival. And secondly, we didn't give money for bad policies that we thought were going to be completely wasted. And I felt it played some role in creating a consensus about not doing that. Let me just apply it in one sentence to Ukraine. We probably right now need to realize that Ukraine needs devaluation, will benefit from a crisis that then turns its, enables it to begin exporting more easily again. And we should help it because it could have some new possibilities then. But we also shouldn't support policies that we know are going to lead to a waste of our assistance.
Yeah. Let me ask you, come back to something you mentioned about Ukraine, the vulnerability of the eastern borders and the presence of Russian troops. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things I heard in Moscow that somebody pretty well connected told me, I don't mean Putin's best pal or anything, but somebody who
lots
had
of people
been,
in Moscow claim to be.
So I was trying to dissociate myself from that
I was going to give you credit for talking to Putin's best pal.
But somebody who had been in the Duma was involved in politics who said, this was a week, at the beginning of the week, he said, well, the decision is taken. If the referendum goes the way everyone expects, the Duma is absolutely going to accept Crimea as part of Russia. There won't be any kind of delay. And he said, basically, they see this as their opportunity. They thought we have a chance to seize, reincorporate Crimea into Ukraine. Well, the same argument could be made for the eastern provinces because, and they are having troop exercises. There's the Ukrainian army, by its own account, really is not capable of resisting Russian incursions. Should NATO or the US actually now send forces to or help to strengthen the border? So this is not a 5-month issue. This is 2 weeks. Exactly.
I think for the short run, focusing on security guarantees or the presence of Western personnel as a tripwire is probably going to be seen and should be seen as too dangerous. But I think we can't pretend that this is something that can be allowed to solve itself. And that means, you talked about creativity in the 40s. We really do need to think about what it takes for a state to be able to hold its provinces together, control its border, create capabilities that it hasn't had. And if that involves some presence, if it involves increased cooperation between our military establishments, that's probably necessary. The result of having Ukraine break up, I think, is going to be so vast across the whole former Soviet space and beyond that we really need to be serious about the scale of the problem without doing anything dumb that's going to get us into a war right away. And that was the mother thought, as I said earlier, of containment strategy in the 40s.
Right. You mentioned creativity. How well served are presidents by the bureaucracy, by the community of people that they draw on as advisors in generating creativity?
Presidents can exercise important leadership here if they really say, I want new ideas. I want you to come back tomorrow morning after you stay up with your staff all night with a better plan than you've got. They're more likely to get it than if they just signal a kind of resignation about the scope of thinking that they'll be satisfied with. I have often commented on the crazy way the United States government is set up by bringing people from the outside who often have no experience and goofy ideas and no ability to work with each other, and into government and challenging them to apply their ideas. And then when administrations change, they go off and they do something else, and sometimes they come back, and other times they don't. I think there are good and bad elements of this. I think it does actually add a kind of fresh thinking, which is often not true of more bureaucratic systems where the only people you turn to for good ideas are the old hands who've been handling the same old problem for the past umpteen decades. The American system of bringing in outsiders, as goofy as it can sometimes seem, does tend to enliven thinking. A lot of these people, by the way, in the 40s that we think of as very creative, were outsiders. Dean Acheson had been in the State Department for quite a while, but he was an outside lawyer. A lot of the people who oversaw the Marshall Plan, Harriman and Will Clayton, they were outsiders too, and I think they brought strength to American policy.
Do you think that the system itself contributes to the kind of I won't say pushing and pulling, but maybe the seesawing between retrenchment and maximalism?
Yeah, absolutely. American presidents often get elected saying, my predecessor was full of it, and we just have to go in a different direction. The historical literature and the political scientists often accept the idea that that's just campaign rhetoric and it doesn't produce policy change. I don't think it's true. I think we actually do go in different directions, and I think it's good. I've become a believer in discontinuity because our leaders, our policymakers, tend to make mistakes. And the only way in which you can fix those mistakes is being ready to change course. The stay the course wisdom often leads you into deeper disaster. I mean, that was Lyndon Johnson's deep insight. Oh, you stay the course. So I think the system that tends to challenge existing policy and bring in people who are committed to doing better has served us okay. It also from time to time brings in people with really bad ideas. Alas.
So a question on diplomacy itself and the role of ambassadors. You were ambassador at large, but this applies more to ambassadors appointed to particular countries. The US, of course, isn't just a state like others. It has values, and it's a very important part, I think, of American thinking about international politics is that the kinds of states we deal with, whether they're democratic or autocratic, that matters a great deal. And that therefore it's important, certainly for, and I guess different presidents put different weight on this, for American ideals and values to spread. And the world would be a much better place if they did. So if you're an ambassador, do you think the nature of diplomacy is changing? You are a professor of the practice of diplomacy. Do you think the nature of diplomacy is changing, and that ambassadors having Twitter accounts and communicating with the population in particular countries, that this is important, or are there risks in that?
It's probably not a smart idea in a broadcast that's being live streamed and taking advantage of current technology to say that I don't think social media is quite as revolutionary in diplomacy as you might think. And not because I don't think that values and communication and transnational trends are not important. To the contrary. But, in the 1990s, there was before Facebook, if you can believe it, a real energy that American foreign policy acquired from and also arrogance and short-sightedness and high-handedness and all of that, from the conviction that the United States had something to offer other societies, and that was related to the victory in the Cold War, and it was related to our willingness to offer assistance and advice and even hectoring lectures to try to create an order in which those values and ideas would be better reflected in what other countries did. And American diplomats incorporated a lot of that into their way of doing business. I don't think, and I think that's been characteristic for a long time. I think American diplomats, even professional ones, and we've got some of my friends who were former professional diplomats here in this group, have stood for the idea that the United States represents something different in the world. And that message has been often abused and often constructive.
So basically, the social media create a different mechanism for getting ideas out, but they don't really change the role of the ambassador. Maybe change the audience that the ambassador can address.
Our mutual friend Mike McFall has created a kind of breakthrough, going from being a Stanford professor to being ambassador in Moscow with, I think, probably the largest Twitter following of any American ambassador anywhere. That, I think, increased his ability to reach out to Russian society. But American ambassadors have been doing that beforehand, and Mike would have been able to do it even without Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, and I see stop in front of me, that's a very good point at which to end. And let me just ask you all to join me in thanking Steve for a great discussion.
Thanks, Pleasure.